as a disclaimer, all 5 of us are complementarian, but we firmly believe that what we're going to share today, we're going to talk about the goodness of God, of men and women working together. And this applies to, we believe it applies whether you're egalitarian or complementarian. I think that's not really the issue today, but it's about how we work together, because we know that even in egalitarian spaces, there's still issues that come up when it comes to issues of men and women. And that's not the answer. Egalitarian is not the answer either to some of the abuses that we've seen in certain arenas of complementarianism. So that's what we want to talk about, the goodness. Now, I'm truly interested in learning from all of you. I serve in a Chinese heritage church, so it's a little different. I've never served in a purely Asian American church. I've never served in a Korean American setting, or Korean or Asian North American setting. And if you were to look at our church's website, you would not know that the woman can run the church, because all you would see are female children's directors and female ministry assistants and office director, but our office manager is basically like an executive director that nothing happens without her. And in all of our meetings, the sisters are there and nothing happens without them. In fact, it's not just the aunties that run the church, but I think in Chinese churches, even when we say we're complementarian, on the Chinese side, there are women teaching men. And then maybe on the English congregation, it may be sisters serving with men, but wanting the men to be pastors. So there's a little bit more of an egalitarianism. I know that's not true of every Chinese setting. So I'm interested to learn, how do we do this well? How do we work together well as men and women in ministry? And I think it's a beautiful example here that we have 2 churches where men and women are serving together on staff. But let's start with a theological foundation, the convictions of why we're not just doing this because this is the right thing to do. It's a cultural moment. No, we believe that this is actually reflects the goodness of God's design, that it's actually better. So Aaron, can you give us a theological foundation of just why we're better together as men and women in ministry?
Yeah, I think before we even talk about men and women, what exactly are we doing? And what we're doing is ministry. And what is ministry? Ministry is soul care. It's leading people to Jesus, leading people to be healed by Jesus, to be transformed by Jesus. And so if that's what ministry is, why wouldn't you activate the entire body of Christ, both men and women, to do ministry together, right? So, because we are better together. And so that's what ministry is. And I think historically speaking, when you even think about the Reformation, oftentimes when we think about the Reformation, we think about reclamation projects like soteriological issues, like justification. But one of the other doctrines that was resurrected during the Reformation was the priesthood of all believers, right? And so during that time, it was only the priests, this subgroup of people, that did ministry. Services were done in Latin, and the subgroup of people were the only ones that could lead people to Christ. And what happened historically during the Reformation was this idea of the priesthood of all believers, right? Not just a subgroup, not just men, not just women, but a priesthood of all believers. We are all priests that are called to do ministry together. And so we see it historically, and I think theologically too. So when you think about, everything starts in Genesis 1. When God made Adam, he made a suitable helper, right? And oftentimes in our context, a lot of the times the word helper is the main emphasis of that phrase. And I think rightly so, the word ezer. And we know that the word ezer is also used of God. So God is our helper. So in no way, shape, or form is the word helper used in a subordinate, inferior kind of way. If anything, I think it connotes someone that is stronger, that can help their weaker counterpart, which is why God is referred to as our ezer, or helper. And so it's totally understandable why there's a lot of emphasis on the word helper. But I also think it's important to place some emphasis on the word suitable too. And that word suitable is the word konegdo. And it's a really difficult word to translate. And this is where we see some gaps in our language translation. But the word ki is like, negdo is unlike. So God made someone that was like Adam and unlike Adam. And I think we can use the word konegdo to help us understand things like marriage, like same-sex marriage versus a biblical view of marriage. It's not someone just that's ki or someone that's negdo, but someone that's kinegdo. But I think that word konegdo can not only be used for marriage, but I think it could also be used in terms of ministry, where God has made us someone where we are like one another, but we're also unlike one another. And in that, there can be some frustrations and difficulties, but in the end, we're better together because this is the way God designed us. For Adam and Eve, not only to be married together, but to do ministry together, even east of Eden. And so there are historical and theological reasons why we are better together and why God made us this way.
Thank you, Aaron. Does anyone else want to chime in on just theological, historical?
Yeah, I think, you brought up the Reformation, but actually present day, I would say the Roman Catholic theologians are far advanced when it comes to a robust theology of gender. And there's two theologians that come to mind, Sister Prudence Allen and Pope John Paul II. They did a lot of work on gender, so if you guys ever want to write a seminary paper, I would recommend looking into some of their work. But in a nutshell, what they talk about is they critique kind of the traditional way of understanding complementarity between men and women. And that traditional way is thinking of men and women as two fractions that make a whole. So thinking men are half and women are a half and they make one whole. And there's kind of a very strong emphasis on the differences between men and women. And the starting point of the conversation when you think like that is these are men's roles, these are women's roles, and then you are plugged into one of those. And that's often how evangelicals think of it too in the church. But what they say is that in reality, it's never half plus half equals one. That in many of our churches, what happens, it's actually a fourth plus 3/4, or 1/3 plus 2/3, because more emphasis is placed on the traditional men's roles, or more roles are given to men in general. And so in place of that, they advocate for what they call an integral complementarity. So instead of seeing men and women as fractions, they're seen as integers. We all are good at math because we're Asian. We know integers are whole numbers, right? And so seeing men and women as whole human beings, so emphasizing the personhood of the person. And so instead of starting the conversation as these are women's roles and these are men's roles and I'm going to do this and Owen's going to do this, it's I, Soojin, as a human being, a whole human being, how do I, uniquely as a woman, give my full self to the service of the church? And how do you, as a human being, do that uniquely as a man to the church, as a service to the church? And I think what's really beautiful is the kind of equation he gives is it's not half plus half equals whole, and it's also not 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 = 3. And Pope John Paul II really emphasizes that when men and women work together and come together, there's a synergetic energy and an effect that happens where you see this most clearly in marriage. When you have man and woman come together, what do you have? You have new life that is born. You have the three. And he says, it's not just in marriage, but even in ministry, in the church context, when you have a man and woman working well together, there is a new fruit and a ministry effectiveness that is born that cannot be there if you don't have both the man and the woman. And so when we think of it in that terms, it's not, how do we squeeze people into defined roles, but how do we all as individual human beings serve the church to our best capacities, given that we are uniquely men and women. And kind of with that foundation, they really emphasize the need for spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers in the church. You know, as in a marriage, you have a father and a mother, and a child is born. And then, Genesis 1:2, it says, men and women both reflect the image of God. And a child is raised in a family by a mother and a father. And so in the church as well, it makes sense. You need fathers and mothers. And if you don't have that, you never get that 1 + 1 = 3. Like you miss out on the fruit that can be born when you uniquely have men and women both working together. So I think that has been a helpful kind of framework for me to work with as I'm understanding it. So I think just emphasizing you need spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers in the church.
Thank you, Soojin. So for someone like me, us. This is, it's academic, it's good. We need to move towards applied theology. So these are solid theological foundations. Asians were creating our own math. 1 + 1 = 3. No, we didn't create it. I know you're quoting someone. So no, it makes sense that we want to be holistic, we want to approach things. What does this look like practically? How does this dream idea look like in reality? Does anyone want to speak to that?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I think there's a difference between the dream of men and women working together and the reality of men and women working together, right? Yeah. And so for all my theological convictions and pastoral sensibilities, I was compelled by the dream. And so at one point, our church staff, as an example, we were 5 male pastors with 1 female staff. And I was convinced that the body of Christ consists of both men and women. Both are gifted for ministry. And the church benefits when all the members of the church, men and women, use their gifts to serve the church. So I wanted to see women's gifts employed at all the levels of our church, and it especially starting with our staff. And so when we were at 5 pastors, 5 male pastors and 1 female staff, the next 4 hires were all women. So that we eventually got to a place where we had 5 men and 5 women on our staff. We achieved the dream. And I realized I love the dream of working with women, but I didn't like the reality of working with women, right? If I can be vulnerable, right? And it's interesting because in kind of our formal spaces, things were great. Like in staff meetings, they think all the men on our staff were very respectful of women. So we respected their space at the table, and we had very cordial, respectful interactions with one another when we're in staff meetings. But where this male-centric culture showed up was in our downtime. So for example, then we would have lunch together. During lunch, I'm just thinking, this is like free time now. And so all 10 of us would go to lunch, but there'd be 2 tables. 1 table for the pastors, 1 table for the women. And the pastors, at that point, I'm not in work mode. I just want to talk about what's fun for me. And so at that time, we're all getting into golf. So all we're doing is talking about golf and poker. That's all we're talking about at the guys' table. And I'm just assuming that the women at the women's table were having their own engaging conversations. And I didn't really think about their experience until our resident prophetess, Soojin, with her courage, always speaks up and said to me, Pastor Owen, it really feels like the women are outsiders looking in, and you guys are at the center. And this culture is not very inclusive for the women, right? And at first I was sad and offended to hear that. And oftentimes whenever Soojin tells me something, I don't like it at first. And then the Holy Spirit works. And then I see the truth and the wisdom of what she says. And ultimately, I don't remember this, but we kind of had like a family meeting, like a powwow. So we got all the men and women together in Pastor Albert's basement, locked our doors, and we gave permission for everyone to just share their grievances, what they didn't like about our staff culture. And the fruit of that was realizing, man, our staff culture was not very inclusive of our women. And so we had to create a new culture that was more inclusive of everyone in the room. And that took some work. But I think we're better for it because we went through the work of creating a new culture that's inclusive of everyone.
Right, so we're talking about now not just structures and philosophy and even practically, professionally, but now we're talking about culture, like not just staff culture, and that flows into church culture. That's good, yeah.
Yeah, as a woman in full-time ministry in a leadership position, I think there are 2 things that come to mind. One is sort of just the external, and then one's the internal. So I'll explain that in a minute. But here, at this conference, I'm sure a lot of the pastors in this room, you're so excited to come here to reconnect with your friends, mentors, make new friends, get connected. I think right after this, there's going to be luncheons for CALI, so the Korean American Leadership Initiative, as well as CHCC, the Chinese Heritage Christian Collaborative, and that's amazing. And so I think for women, however, there often is either a lack of awareness or we just don't know like where we go to for similar types of things. And so it often feels like you're sort of on your own to make those connections. And if you're a woman in a leadership position in a church, you're likely more of a self-starter and a go-getter, so it comes more naturally to you. But it is an added layer of like another thing that you're trying to figure out. Who do I talk to? Is there an elder woman who's been doing this for a while that I can just bounce ideas off of, kind of get her wisdom? Maybe not just on certain situations, but like how to have longevity in ministry, or how to just like operate in specific roles. And so I think that's one thing that's just a reality for women in full-time ministry, and can be difficult, depending on where you're coming from. And I think internally, maybe just speaking for myself, and maybe some of the women in here can relate, there is somewhat of an internal thought battle, if I can call it that, where a lot of the times you may want to be brave like Soojin and, bring something up, but then, Owen or Aaron or Hanley is really busy with being a senior pastor, because you see all of the things that they do and all of the conversations that they have, all the known situations and kind of last minute things that come up that they have to take care of. And so there is a little bit of a calculation in your mind on when is the right time. I feel like it's better sooner than later, but also, I want to be respectful and not demanding. And I think that adds a layer of burden on the mind that, you can say it's fine for a while, but at a certain point you have to have that conversation. So I think part of it's on me to be wise and discerning and try to find that right time. And if I don't know what the right time is, just kind of going for it and in faith, just trying to be gracious. And then sometimes I think Aaron would say this too. I'd be thinking so much about when to say, what to say, and then in the end, it was a very simple conversation. So I know part of it could be in your head, but I think a lot of women sort of struggle with the same thing of, again, not wanting to be an added burden, but also wanting to, serve their pastors well by being thoughtful in how they approach these conversations. So
I think building off of what Heidi is saying, I think we're just kind of sharing the difficulties right now of the reality, right? With every conversation where I confronted Pastor Owen, on the surface I looked really brave and confident, but that came with hours of wondering, is this worth bringing up? Should I be bringing it up? Me asking the other women on staff, do you think I should bring it up? Is this worth bringing? And then that internal battle. And so I think there's a mental load that comes with just simply being female on a staff. And then I think also one of the things is I just didn't realize how much the pastors and elders didn't know. And I don't think you knew what you didn't know, because there's just so many things that you've never thought of, and it's not your fault. And I walked into kind of working at the church not realizing that, wow, wanting to eat lunch at the same table requires a conversation. And then me wanting to join staff meetings requires a conversation, or, me getting regular pay there are so many things where, because I came from,
it's getting real.
I want to be honest, but these are probably the things that the women in this room are thinking, is that I came from the secular working world, right, where those things were not things I had to think through. And so I didn't realize walking into it that, actually, everything requires a conversation, because no one has ever brought these things up before. And it's a real test of my patience too. And also, how do I be gracious in that, knowing that it's not your fault, right? It's not anybody's fault, and nobody's doing it maliciously. But I think, just kind of building off what Heidi said, what I realize is it requires an additional layer of endurance. I went to a luncheon for a seminary campus for female students recently, and I was sharing one of the things I realized is you need an additional layer of endurance as a female in ministry. And the whole room collectively sighed and nodded. And I just felt that, wow, all of these women are experiencing the same thing that I did. That ministry is already so hard and tough, as I'm sure everyone in this room can attest. But on top of that, you are constantly needing to think additionally, walk on more eggshells, and have more endurance in believing that you actually belong here, that you belong in ministry, these internal and external factors. And so I do think, there's just more mental load and endurance required that I don't think we knew what we needed when we were walking into ministry.
So we've talked about, we've kind of established the dream the ideal. We talked about, I guess, some of the difficulties, some of the challenges and hurdles. And that may start with just feeling confident and feeling like there's room to have a conversation. Now, after those conversations are had, can you give some examples of how or what does it look like practically that men and women serving together in ministry is better together? Some practical examples. Anyone can chime in.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. Having women on our staff and women who are able to voice their opinions through Soojin to the rest of us, the pastors became better pastors. We have so many blind spots that we're not even aware of. And we're looking at issues primarily from a male perspective. Our church is more than 50% female. And it's just so important for us as pastors to realize, wow, how would this land with women? And we don't know until the women on our staff say, that I don't think will land very well. And we've had to rethink so many things. And I think it's made myself and all the other pastors just better pastors and leaders, right? Additionally, as we're more intentional about having women in visible places of leadership, like on the platform or praying, presiding, whatever it is, what I wanted to do at our church was to stretch the collective imagination of our church about what women can and should do in ministry. I think for so many of us, we have a posture of what do we permit women to do in church, right? That's a terrible posture. It should be, how can we celebrate women using their gifts to serve the body and to honor Christ? And how do we encourage women to do that? And I, for example, I have two daughters, and I wanted them to grow up in a church where they saw that women can use their gifts to serve beyond, these are ministries that are absolutely vital, okay? Beyond children's ministry, beyond hospitality, beyond women's ministry, beyond church administrations. Those are absolutely vital, but those are not the only ways that gifted, godly women can use their gifts to serve the church. And I think sometimes you just kind of need to see someone do what you never saw people do. And it just kind of stretches the collective imagination of our church so that the next generation, it's, for example, when we first had women presiding in our service, there was a lot of fear, there's reluctance, but now I think we're at a place where it's just normal. And we just have to normalize women in ministry, and I think that's kind of our contribution to the next generation of female leaders in the Asian American church.
That's good. Oh, you got some applause.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I mean, there's so many examples that we can give. I think another really good example is, and along the lines of being more visible and being more seen. Every one of our churches, at one point or another, are going to experience some kind of abuse, right? So emotional abuse, sexual abuse, some kind of physical abuse or something, right? If you're a woman in particular that is a victim, and you experience this in the church, and you're in a room that is surrounded by all men, just imagine what even that could feel like. And so at this point, it should be ministry 101. When a woman experiences something like that, they need to be surrounded by other sisters. And so again, this is what I talk about, where they need to be more visible, more seen. And we have to activate women to be in these positions of care and ministry. And so that's just, a very specific example of how we are so much better together doing what we do.
That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of going back to what Pastor Owen was saying, yes, the makeup of your staff does send a message. At the same time, no person, man or woman, wants to be in some kind of token role, right? Yeah. And especially for women, I think it's important to have women in, again, we need women in children's ministry and the other roles that you specify, but also women in other meaningful positions that can serve the church maybe in a new way that we hadn't thought about before. And so as you were talking, I was just reminded of, I work a lot with college students, and so a lot of college students are recent grads who may be coming back to church for the first time or just became a believer in college. They'll come up to me and say something like, "Oh, it's so cool that you're doing this and like you're in this position at this church." And like going back to just widening the imagination of people, and not just for the female students, but also for the male students. If they've never experienced something like that, it's they by attending our ministry and attending our church, they experience the blessing of being ministered to by like wonderful pastors, as well as gifted women on staff who are seminary trained and who can answer their questions and maybe ask them questions back to, so I think especially for Gen Z or just the young people in the churches, I've been sort of pleasantly surprised, and it's always encouraging to hear that it's encouraged them in some way. Yeah.
And I think just practically too, you pull from a much bigger pool of gifts and talents when you look at both men and women, right? Like it's foolish to think that God would only gift the men of your church with teaching abilities or certain, and I think when you start pulling from the whole congregation, you just open that door to so much more fruitful, effective ministry in your church in all facets of your church, I think. Yeah.
Let me just add this because Soojin will never say it. But when Soojin was on staff with us, she was our sharpest theologian. And I think as pastors, we need to have the security to say that sometimes women are just sharper than you theologically. It's okay to say that. And so Soojin spearheaded our ministry called Christ Central Institute, and she was our primary teacher. Because that was a minister of our church where we discussed and tackled very complex issues from a theological perspective. And Soojin was always the lead with that. And we were so well served by Soojin's ministry. So women are sometimes the best theological scholars in the room. And we don't have to be afraid to say that. Embrace that, and then let them use their gifts to serve the body. Right?
Yeah, I think for male lead pastors in this room or male who supervise me, I think a question that I have to look in the mirror and ask myself is, would I submit under the supervision of a female? Right? Because that's something that Soojin mentioned in the secular workplace. It's your job. The local church, even in our theological tradition. So our church, we're Southern Baptists, and so there's a whole discussion going on right now, but we don't have ordained woman pastors, and so outside of anything held by any exercise of the ordained office, if there's an executive director, business manager, personnel, meaning your HR, the person who takes care of all of your finances, if you delegate something to them and they say, "No, pastor, we can't spend the money that way. No, we cannot produce these ministries in the timeline that you want," would I be okay seeing that person in their position being supervised by them, even as a leader, senior pastor, right? And I think it's harder in the local church, especially complementarian churches. And so that's something that I'm still working through. I don't know if any of Aaron or Owen, if you can speak to that. While putting you on the spot, it's okay, you don't have to,
Isn't Heidi your boss? Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, Heidi does run our staff meetings, and she helps shape our session meetings and stuff like that too. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, Aaron and the rest of the pastoral staff has been very gracious. And it's the first time my role was newly created when I was hired into it. So there was an understanding that we don't really know, and we're going to figure it out. And sometimes it's like tough conversations. Sometimes that's hashing things out for the first time, where I just assumed he knew something, as Soojin was mentioning earlier, but it required conversation. And I think for anyone who may be struggling with this or kind of heading down that route, I think there is no framework, there is no model that you can just look to and be like, yeah, that's it. Like, we're going to operate like that. And so just know, like, you have to put in the work. And I think in the end, you will be better for it. But when you're in it, I think sometimes it's uncomfortable and a little bit like murky. But as long as, you know, all parties involved are have the same vision and are kind of working towards that, it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, but I will add to that, like, I think personally what I found, and this is just specifically within the complementarian context, is because if you are in a complementarian context, no matter what title role you have, you still submit to male eldership and leadership. The more clarity the senior pastor can give, the better. Meaning, you know, Pastor Owen says, like, I led all this, like, you know, the theology classes and stuff, but he was so clear that I report to him and that ultimately he is my senior pastor and that the buck starts with him. And that is actually a really good and healthy thing. And it freed me from the pressure of, what if someone questions what I teach? You know, what if someone questions the fact that I am teaching? Well, they can talk to Owen. And that, but you would be surprised, like, without that clarity and without Pastor Owen verbalizing to me, like, I have your back and you are free to do this under my supervision. If I didn't have that, I would not have been able to freely do the things that I did confidently, because I would constantly be questioning, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to say this? Like, what is the extent? And so I think the more clarity you receive, even within those boundaries, the more freedom you, like, I think women can have in that complementarian context.
So it seems like in your context or what you just explained, Owen kind of made it very clear to the staff, even to the church, and that provided safety, security for you to flourish or even lead in where you've been assigned to lead or you want to lead, right? Now, Heidi and Soojin, so this is my question. Maybe a bad question. If it's a bad question, just say, Hanley, it's a bad question. I submit, all right? That's how it is on our staff at our church, and you know, you can tell, right? You can just say yes or no if you want to, if you don't want to elaborate, but you can tell if there's well-meaning male pastors who are just saying, you know what, because of the cultural moment or because it's the right thing to do, let's just have more women on our staff. Let's just add a female to the rotation, the speaking rotation. Let's have her give announcements and read scripture. Can you tell the difference, how, you know, versus do they actually care about what's in your mind, what you bring to the table, and listen to you, not just hear what you say, but care about listening to your contribution? I set it up for you that you can just say, Hanley, that's a bad question. This, you know, Matthew 18, this needs to, you know.
I guess it depends on the nature of my relationship with said person. So if there's someone I don't know and they say something that's, I'm like, oh, I'm like probably just gonna smile and be like, oh, thank you, you know, something like that. But if it's someone that I know well, and Aaron and Owen probably know this, like and maybe you know this too, Hanley, if I have like a closer relationship with someone, I'm a lot more direct and I'll just say what I think. And so, you know, if I believe that it would be good for the overall situation for me to both express maybe a situation that happened and the impact that it had on me in a way where it's trying to like serve a purpose, then I will. But again, it sort of depends on, to answer your question, like, you know, pretty closely to, yeah, it depends, and I can tell, and I'll just respond accordingly. So.
I think, because you're kind of asking, like, how do we respond to the fact that there are certain pastors who, you know, they want to support women, but they don't do quite the work to like bring in all the depth of what women can bring. And I think kind of parallel to that, you know, when I thought about being on this panel and I talked to Heidi about it, if there's one thing I want to say to all senior pastors, what would it be? And it's kind of parallel to that, which is, I have seen so many women around me, just so many, countless, who have the heart for ministry, have the gifting for ministry, and the thing that burns them out is they are stuck in I support women limbo with their pastor. Meaning, Their pastor brings them on for some nebulous role that's not defined. Their pastor says, and they do, I think they do genuinely in their heart, they support women, and they tell them, I support you. But they have not done the work of actually sitting down and thinking through, what does that actually look like at my church? What are the actual roles you can do? What does your job description actually look like? What are the boundaries and what are the things that you can freely run with? Like, they haven't done that. And so the female staff is stuck with, in this nebulous area of, my pastor supports me, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what I'm allowed to do. And I just want to say that is the most unhealthy place to be, because both parties will grow in frustration. The female will be frustrated because she's not getting clarity. The pastor will be frustrated because I support you. Why are you mad at me? And it will suck the life out of both people. And I don't know why they keep giving me a mic. I'm going to say these things. If you cannot put in the time and energy to get to the point of like tangible roles and responsibilities, I dare say maybe you are not yet ready to have female staff.
That's good.
And if you really want female staff and you want to support them, I think you need to go that extra mile. And I tell everybody around me, Pastor Owen, I love serving under Pastor Owen, and I left because of circumstances, but if I had things my way, I would have served under Pastor Owen for a very long time. And one of the things is, he has never once made me feel like he doesn't know what to do with me because I'm a woman. Actually, maybe you give me too much to do. But I have never, ever once felt that I questioned my job description, my role. And before he even brought me on staff, I remember we were at a cafe sitting and he said, hey, my elders and I, we went through this. These are our convictions. These are what we believe women can do in our church. What do you think? And every step along the way, it was Pastor Owen who said, hey, I think you should teach this. I think you should lead this panel. And during my 5 years, I never once questioned, oh my gosh, what is my place here? Like, what am I supposed to do? Am I allowed to do this? Before I even had those questions, Pastor Owen already answered those things for me. And I think if you want women in your staff who want to serve with you and will not burn out simply from being a woman, you cannot keep them stuck in that limbo of, I'm bringing you on because you're a woman and I support women, but I cannot do the work of defining these things for you. I think I may humbly submit, you might just not be in a place, maybe you're ready to have a female staff.
So to quote a friend of mine, Pastor Jonathan Cito, clarity over confusion.
Yes.
Clarity over confusion. But he used that in a dating context. But like when you DTR, clarity over confusion. But yes, in appropriate, proper staff relations, clarity over confusion. Yeah.
You can say clarity is kindness.
Yeah. That's I was fishing for that, for the Soojin to come out, without saying that, yeah, you got to do it, But any final words from any of the panelists?
Maybe from a senior pastor's perspective, I think it's very easy for senior pastors to think that their staff, whether it's male or female staff, are there to assist them to pursue or achieve whatever kingdom dreams that God has given to them. And I think in one aspect that's right. I think where I'm learning to grow is, as a leader, is I'm learning to listen to and to help achieve the kingdom dreams that God has given to each of my assistant pastors and women on staff, right? Because they are individual, precious, image-bearing people of God that have kingdom dreams too, right? And I think, and so the joke at my staff is that I feel like I have 10 bosses, and my assistant pastors boss me around, and I say that jokingly, but what I want to communicate to them is like, man, your thoughts, your opinions, your dreams really matter. It's not less important than mine. And then how do we work together so we can help one another become the servants that God has called us to be, whether men or female. And I think it's a posture of humility. I think I'm still growing it because I'm very stubborn and I want things my way. But I think part of the sanctifying process is to bring along the Soojin Parks and the Bobby Suhs and everyone who have enough love and courage to speak truth and love to you. Yeah. To tell you things that you don't want to hear, but it's good for you to hear. And I think that's how our staff actually grows closer together, and we're just a better functioning staff when that happens. Right?
I think just one thing to the women in the room, if you are struggling through these kind of things, one thing that helped me tremendously, and I had to learn it kind of the hard way, is don't ever assume bad intent of your pastors. Walk into every conversation assuming the best, giving every full benefit of the doubt. Because quite often, people just don't know what they don't know, and it's not their fault. And the more you make it about me versus them, the less helpful it is. And I think the more you and your pastor can get on the same page of we are a team, how do we do this team thing well together, is just going to be better. And so I think it's really hard, and it's a lot of swallowing of pride, but yeah, don't fall into a victim mentality. You're not a victim of the situation, right? Like you are there to, again, like you have your kingdom dreams, you're there to serve. God has called you there. How do you serve and honor your pastor well, but also confront them in a loving manner and give the full benefit of the doubt that they care for you? I think that's really, really important.
Really quickly, when our church first started, it was actually 80% women. So it did not look like a fraternity; it looked like a sorority. And to be honest, that is a picture of what the global church looks like. You know, when you think about what a global Christian looks like today, it is not a white male Republican. It is a dark-skinned woman from the global South. Most missionaries are women, and therefore a lot of converts are women. And so to be for women, to activate women, to be loyal to women, to admonish and advocate women is, it's so important. And so, I just want to close with some of those thoughts.
Thanks, Aaron. Any final words?
Why am I saying the final?
You get the final word.
All right. Well, I guess, another encouragement for anyone, I guess, in this room, but especially women, is change takes a long time. So whatever change that is that you're trying to see, I used to be in consulting, and there was an arm of our organization where they were called change management consultants. So they're hired to literally help big corporations make a change. And at the time, I thought this is kind of silly, but then over time, I saw just how important having their work and their structure and everything they brought to the table was. And so, of course, at a church with a much smaller, budget and resources, is going to look different. But if you are kind of in this position where you want to see all these changes, it's not happening, I just want to encourage you and say, obviously, prayer should be a big part of this. And sometimes, in the process of going through something, you learn new things that you wouldn't have had you had gotten to point B tomorrow instead of maybe 6 months or maybe 5 years from now. And so to not give up and, to try to see what God is teaching you in this current season, and know that He can use you and the rest of your staff members for His glory right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Soojin. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Aaron, for your time. Thank you for being honest, vulnerable, transparent. I know this is just the start of a conversation that if we're going to write the next chapter together, we're going to truly have to do it together as men and women.